Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Okay, so as she said, I'm Will Bridewell from the what's now the Cognitive Systems Laboratory at Stanford University. Used to be the Computational Learning Laboratory, and this is joint work with Pat Langley and a lot of other people in that lab, some of whom I'll mention as the talk goes on. So I'm going to start by giving an introduction to inductive process modeling, which is a modeling paradigm that supports automated modeling, and I'll go through that. I'll talk about some constraints in inductive process modeling, and then again, I'll talk about how we can learn constraints and what that means. So, inductive process modeling, you start to what it expects is a set of observations and some knowledge. And the observations are time series for multiple variables, as you see on the left. And what it produces is a model that can, from initial conditions and possibly some forcing data, produce simulations that, like the green lines, basically trajectories, that are predictions of what the system under study how that system would perform. But more than that, the model also explains the behavior that's occurring within the system. So the goals here are for explanation and prediction. This paradigm was introduced in 2002 at ICML, International Conference of Machine Learning, and we recently had a paper in 2008 in the Machine Learning Journal that goes into more detail. So inductive process modeling is founded around quantitative process models as a knowledge representation, and this is a brief slide to show what that means, and I'll continue to go in more detail. But we start off with ordinary differential equations, which is how the scientists that we work with tend to model their systems. And what we do is we add just a little bit of structure to it by giving pieces of these equations names. So as you can see, maybe you can see, it's color-coded. So that pieces of the equations, like 2.5 times hair density, which is green, is actually refers to the exponential growth process in this set of equations, which are typical predator-prey equations. And what's important to note on this slide is the predation process, where you can have pieces that cut across equations associated with a single process. And this gives a confidential feel to the process models. It also adds conceptual structure to the equations. If you see the equations as they stand, they're just going to look like regular mathematical equations. But if you add the process information, that ties the meaning of the equation or reveals the meaning of the equation as it relates to scientific knowledge. So the advantage of the quantitative process models is they embed quantitative relations within a qualitative structure. So they tie the quantitative to the qualitative. They refer to notations and mechanisms familiar to experts. So they use the equations formalism that the experts use. They use the terminology that the experts would use to describe their processes. And they provide dynamical predictions of change over time, as the first slide showed. They offer causal and explanatory accounts of phenomena. That is, you're not just talking about a descriptive model. You're actually modeling the processes and the mechanism that drives the system. And while they also have this notion of modularity, which lets us induce or abduce models from data and knowledge. So what do I mean by that? Again, here's the same model that we looked at before, but by modularity, what I mean is, say I wanted to get rid of, if I wanted to change some of the dynamics within this model, which are the processes, I can just remove the predation process, and the equations would adjust accordingly. So I'm taking so it's not like I would have to go in and hand edit each individual equation. I can pull out everything associated with predation at once, and then replace it with another predation process of whatever complexity. So this lets us, it's like we have building blocks for models in this case. Those building blocks we can also produce templates for, which we call generic processes. And this is like the predation process we just saw. The difference is that it has entity roles, P1 and P2, which are played by a prey and a predator. It has, instead of numerical parameters, it has constants. It has parameters that fall within some range. Here they have to be positive real numbers, R and E. And you see the equations, instead of referring to wolves and hares and having numbers in them, refer to the entities, P1.density, P2 density, and refer to E and R. So this is like just like a template or a generic. And we can instantiate that by assigning actual entities like hare and wolf to the entity roles, and by assigning constants to the parameters like 0.1 and 0.3. And this gives us the process that we had before, renamed here wolves eat hares. But these are the steps that you go through to take, and it's fairly, you could see where it could be automated. Go through, you'd have a collection of generic processes, and you'd instantiate them, and you would get a collection of instantiated processes. Again, you could build models from, and this is what really helps us deal with the automated and modeling aspects. So we have the IPM system, Inductive Process Modeling System, not a clever name. This is a naive approach. The actual system operates, it's a little more complicated, but this is basically what happens. You have a library of generic entities and generic processes. You have instantiated entities, so like wolves or rabbits. And you have the data, like the trajectories I showed on an earlier slide. So you have the time series for the variables so that you can fit the data or predict the data. Now, the steps you take are you first ground the generic processes with instantiated entities. So you take a predation process and you say, well, this is predation between wolf and hare. It's not just predation. It's predation between two instantiated species here. Then you generate all combinations of the ground processes. And each combination is each combination is one piece of a model, or each combination is a model. Each ground process is one component in that model. And then once you have the structure of the model, you can fit the numeric parameters using the data that were given. And you output the best models based on the fit to the data. And we've had success in this in areas of aquatic ecosystems where we do most of our work. Also fjord dynamics, biochemical kinetics, protist interactions, and photosynthesis. You can see some of these in the 2008 machine learning article. It's one of my favorites of the year, so I encourage you to look at that. So where are we going? What happened next? Well, early versions, after we developed IPM, we saw that it helps scientists formalize their modeling knowledge. So the ecologists that we worked with were able to formalize their knowledge and present it and use these tools with substantial training. It lets scientists consider several alternative models. So instead of focusing on a single model or a handful of models and fitting the parameters and spending a lot of time and attention on those, they can now look at hundreds or thousands of models defined by the search space, which is how all these components and how they piece together. Also, it reduces some of the drudgery of model construction, and model construction is hard. Tuning parameters is hard. You'd like to take some of the work away, the irritating work away from scientists, and it speeds the exploration and evaluation of the phenomena of the scientific phenomena that they're studying. So, the big problem is that the naive approach, and even more sophisticated versions of that, produce several structurally implausible models. So maybe it might produce a model that has an exponential growth process for a prey and a logistic growth process for a prey. And whenever you're talking about the growth, what's controlling growth in a species, you generally have one idea of what type of process would be explaining the growth. So those would be models like that would be implausible. And what we had to do is introduce model constraints to eliminate some of those implausible models, to reduce the size of the search space, because once you start constraining the search space, you have fewer model candidates. This, in turn, makes complex domains attractable, and improves model accuracy during incomplete search, which was an empirical finding that we reported in the paper below. HIPM, it was a system called HIPM by Lupcho Todorovsky and other colleagues in our lab. It presented at AAAI 2005. The structural constraints differ from constraints on model behavior. Sometimes we talk about constraints on, well, it has to go. The simulation has to peak at this particular point, and then it has to, the curve has to drop, and there have to be relationships between the various trajectories. The structural constraints I'm talking about are really about the model structure. Which processes are included? How can you build a model and have it be plausible? This means that you don't have to simulate the model, and more importantly, you don't have to fit the parameters of the model, which is where 99% of our computational time goes. Because these are nonlinear dynamic systems and parameter estimation is computationally intensive. So some of the constraints that we've introduced are, this one is a constraint. Its type is necessary constraint. It's about nutrient replenishment. And what it says is that if you have a nutrient mixing process for some nutrient, then you also must have a remineralization process for some, or actually it says you must have both nutrient mixing and remineralization for some nutrient. Okay. So any process in that list would have to appear. And the variables you see, like the n, allow you to say it's like in logic, for all n such that n is a nutrient. It's this type of relationship. We also have always together, which is what I misstated before. But always together says if you have a limited growth process for a primary producer, then you must have a nutrient limitation process for that primary producer with a nutrient, because something has to be limiting the growth if you have limited growth. And it makes no sense to have nutrient limitation without a limited growth in this case. Okay, there's also ways to express mutual exclusion, and there's also ways that at most one is like mutual exclusion, except one of the options is not to have any of the processes. Now, these constraints are implemented in the SC-IPM system for structurally constrained inductive process modeling. And the way this works, I'm just going to cover mostly what's different between it and IPM, is that you ground the generic processes with instantiated entities to get your model components. And those processes, those ground processes, become Boolean literals in a logic sentence. So now we're talking about what we have is we have propositional logic sentence here, where the constraints give you the form of that sentence. So we rewrite the constraints so that they talk about the processes and they appear in conjunctive normal form, which turns the whole problem of constructing a model structure into a satisfiability problem. And if you don't know about satisfiability problems, there have been in '93 and since then, there have been very fast algorithms developed to solve satisfiability problems that are highly constrained, have lots of variables. And it's a very robust field, so it really is a type of technology that you can take and you can plug into whatever system you have. So once you have a sentence written out in conjunctive normal form, you make a call to the sat solver and we get a model structure back. And then we can fit its parameters. And we can do this over and over again. And we can get different model structures and explore the space. The advantages of SC-IPM are that the constraints, of course, limit the consideration of implausible models. Now we don't see as many models. And the models that we do see are more plausible, make more sense scientifically. The constraint modularity is a big advantage. So each constraint that I showed you is an individual constraint that can be turned on or turned off depending on whether you want to expand the exploration of your space. So you could define a highly constrained space if you want and then start turning off constraints and explore the regions that opens up and have a fine-tuned control about in the context of a model revision process. Okay. The constraints that we use typically come from scientists' implicit knowledge. This isn't the type of thing that gets published necessarily in textbooks or papers. But if you show them a model, they can tell you that model doesn't make any sense, and they can tell you why. So we can elicit these constraints through examples, or we can even learn them computationally, which is where I'm going to go on to next. Okay. Learning these sorts of constraints, I think, is an important direction for scientific methodology, and hopefully you'll see why as I go through these stages. But the idea is to identify the implicit or unknown constraints. So that, one, there are actually two goals. One is that we can use those in future modeling tasks. So I learn that this system should have been constrained in a more tightly, and then when I go to model a similar system, then I can use that knowledge to reduce the amount of search that I do in the future. The other goal is to just identify what these constraints are. Sometimes the constraints are not as obvious as you might think, and it's hard to generate them implicitly. And sometimes they can even reveal novel scientific relationships. So the plan is to analyze the space of model structures using machine learning techniques. And this research was originally reported at the Inductive Logic Programming Conference in 2007. We also had a paper at Knowledge Capture and a more recent one at AAAI Workshop on Transfer Learning. So the way we learn constraints is we build and parameterize process models. We don't throw any of them away. All the work we did, we save. And then we formally describe the structure of the models. What I mean by that is you say model 1 has this process, this entity, the entities and processes are related in this way. So there's a formal description of what the structure looks like, and that's easily automated. Then you identify which models are good and bad, and I'll show you that in just a second. And then we used inductive logic programming systems to generate rules that describe the structures that are good and bad, and these become the constraints. And we used inductive logic programming because we're essentially talking about the relationships, a relational structure of the model. How do these different components relate to each other, and so forth. And then we can convert these into constraints. The way we look, this is a good slide for a couple of reasons. I put this in here to show how we distinguish between good and bad models. And we go through and we identify candidate thresholds automatically, and then we can pick a particular threshold and say everything, for instance, to the left is a good model, everything to the right is a bad model. And so that's basically how we do our labeling from a machine learning perspective. But what's really interesting here is, and this is what keyed us into the idea of learning constraints, is you see that plateau at the top. That's roughly 250 models that perform almost equally well. And you show this to, this is evidence of an underdetermined system, basically. You don't have enough data to decide between these. But you show that it doesn't dishearten people, the scientists, the ecologists that we work with. The first thing that they ask is, what's going on with those models up front? What do they have in common? What's going on? Why are there these plateaus? So another use of this learning constraints is to identify the features or the characteristics of some of these really good models, learn characteristics of the bad models, and try to figure out what's distinguishing between those sets. Okay. So some of the constraints that we extract, I'm going to look at the second one down because it's kind of the easiest to understand. It says a model that includes the Lotka-Volterra grazing process will be inaccurate. And there was positive support for that. There were 80 models where that was positive, that was true. There were no models where that was untrue for this particular domain. So that's a fairly strong constraint. So it says this one particular process, you shouldn't use it if you're trying to model these interactions. Now, the one below it is more complex in that it says that it actually lists there are two processes that relate specific entities. So the monad growth limitation, there are a couple different functional forms of that. And it relates iron and phytoplankton. So what this says is iron, if your model lacks a monad growth limitation between iron and phytoplankton, then it will be inaccurate. So this is arguing for a very strong interaction between iron and phytoplankton. That is, if you had a model where the phytoplankton were limited by some other nutrient, such as nitrate or phosphate, it wouldn't reproduce the behavior that you've seen in your data. Now that's a very strong claim to make. Is again you see that plateau up in the front. Well, you say, well, what can we learn from underdetermined systems? Well, we can learn general principles like these. Okay, this is a slide showing application of constraints to other problems. How much does it actually save us? And what's worth pointing out here is that mostly is that the dark line that's the constrained case, and it reaches the maximum performance or the maximum accuracy at 100 after looking at 120 models, and the thinner line goes out to 1100. And what these are models ranked by their performance. So the 120th model is the 0th model will be the worst, and in the constraint case, the 120th is the best, and in the no constraint case, the 1105th is the best. So you're saving a large part of your search, and you'll notice that the distribution has shifted here, and that you're not getting a lot of the really bad models. You're actually cutting out a lot of the bad models. It quickly jumps up to more of the models within a reasonable range of accuracy. This is another example. And it's mostly just to show that we can apply constraints across domains. The previous one was the same domain. It was an aquatic ecosystem in the Southern Ocean, where it's obviously a saltwater ecosystem. And it was across years, transferring constraints across years. Here we're transferring constraints from a saltwater ecosystem in the Antarctic to a freshwater ecosystem in Europe. So the constraints do seem to transfer, even though those ecosystems scientifically are quite different. The constraints, the general principles, seem to hold and transfer well across those domains. So just a couple more slides. First, the related work. This grew out of work by Lupcho Todorovsky and Sasha Dozorovsky at Slovenia on Lagrange, which was an equation discovery system. And then we're also influenced by PREP, by Liz Bradley and Reinhard Stolle. Liz Bradley's at University of Colorado. And there's some other meta-learning research that has also played a role in terms of giving us an idea of what type of meta-learning, which is what learning constraints is in a sense, has been examined in the past. And these are a few of the systems fairly close to ours. I want to end on future directions, where we want to continue in analyzing constraint transfer. It's nice if the constraints can transfer, for instance, across problem to problem within the same domain, but how far can we stretch it? How general are these principles? Can we get an idea of the generality of principles and understand at what level are whether these are exhibit deep theoretical knowledge, or if they're just ad hoc sorts of constraints and we're getting lucky. We also want to close the automated modeling and constraint learning loop, by which I mean that you model the system. Imagine a black box where you feed data and your knowledge in. It builds models of the system, then goes off on its own, does some constraint learning. You feed in another modeling problem. It takes less time. You feed in another modeling problem. It takes less time. And so, but the idea is that you would continue adding constraints. The software system would continue to learn about how to model various ecosystems or systems of scientific interest. We also want to base new analyses and methodologies on model ensembles, much like identifying these general principles from the constraints. And we want to adapt these to other tasks. It's not just good for scientific modeling. I think that especially the learning of constraints, learning of general characteristics of plausible and implausible structures is good for any sort of domain where you have, when you produce some structure at the end, any structural model. You don't need to have processes and entities, in other words. So again, we want to support other modeling paradigms. And so inductive process modeling, when I came in, was predominantly organized around helping scientists refine and build models, and it's grown to be more focused on helping scientists, giving scientists new methodology and helping scientists understand what the systems that they're modeling better, and helping us build new computational tools for them to study those systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. Couple of questions?
I got a question. First, I would like to ask, how big is the search space that you're talking about?
So how big is the search space? The search space is, in some cases, it can be, well, in the unconstrained search spaces, we would easily get into the thousands of models, and we would have to use ad hoc tricks to cut that down in some situations. Model structures. Yes, it's different. The whole spaces. So model structures, there may be, and currently, I think the largest one that we've worked with recently has been about 52,000 model structures. And of course, once you have a model structure, then you have to do parameter estimation. And of course, the size of the parameter estimation space is effectively infinite in that the parameters are real numbers. But it's navigable, so we can. But it does take extra search and extra time to once you have those.
I just saw one slide with this table that we constructed here. You basically shrink the search space like 5 times or 16 times smaller. So if some people want to further shrink this search space, what's the normal way it can be?
So what's going on here on this slide is that what I didn't mention is that the thin line was already a constrained search space. These were already let's see. These 1,100 models were already developed or already produced by a library of generic processes that had constraints associated with it. What in the thick line is about it incorporates the constraints that we learned on top of those. So in a sense, there's always room for improvement, or at least that's what it seems here. We need to do more, of course, more analyses. But as you can see, we're still looking at there are some models here that aren't being ruled out, and it'd be nice to know how to get rid of those. So.
Can I just add to that? It's not a real question.
It's up front.
Good.
Stay close to it.
So, in some sense, we could the traditional rhetoric about using machine learning to aid scientific discovery is to get rid of these constraints. We want to search through a vast space of possible models to discover things that we don't even suspect. And we specifically are not taking that approach. We think that generally, at least in sciences like ecology, where people are building fairly advanced models, that they really do have some pretty good ideas about what kind of stuff's going on. Doesn't mean that there isn't room for being surprised. Certainly, the whole approach we take requires that you can't, if you don't have a process in the background knowledge, it's not going to consider a model with that process. So there's also the room for possibly for discovering new processes too. That probably would be a more data-driven kind of thing than what we've got now. But the whole philosophy of our approach is let's combine knowledge with data, particularly in fields like ecology where we don't have as much data as we would like. So the answer is we can constrain the space more or less. The less we constrain it, the bigger the search, the more likely you'll find something that you didn't expect, and also the more likely it's going to be nonsense because our systems certainly found models that scientists look at and they go, are you kidding? That doesn't make any sense. And that's actually one of the things that led us to trying to introduce the constraints. It was that they were telling us that our space was malformed.
Next one.
Do you have any sort of mechanism in which you store the most successful models or whatever, so the scientists that will want to run similar experiments can learn from others and reuse the models or part of the models?
So we had, for being in a research prototype sort of system, we had a rudimentary way to store and then rerun models that were considered we're building into the new system a more, I don't know, advanced is right, but one that's easier to use, one where it's easier to just restart as opposed to typing all sorts of arcane commands. One point I'd like to add, though, is since there are a lot of high-performance computing people here, is one question that sometimes comes up is, well, you know, you're only looking at 1,000 or a couple thousand model structures. Why not just get more processors? Why not use the grid? And the answer to that is, well, okay, there are several climatological models, and many of them take weeks or more just to simulate. And you can imagine doing parameter estimation on those would take months, maybe years. So computational power is helpful, but again, there's always room for adding more knowledge and constraining the space more.